Today's reading will be taken from 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 9 through 17. Again, that's 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 9 through 17. Once they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on his chair by the doorpost of the Lord's house. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. And she made a vow, saying, Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. As she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk, and said to her, How long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine. Not so, my lord, Hannah replied. I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. Eli answered, Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him.
It's always interesting when we get to an occasion like Mother's Day or Father's Day or some of the other special, maybe not quite so significant days, because there are so many ideas that are associated with things like motherhood and fatherhood. We often think as human beings of the ideals that we or our society has. There's often a different reality for some people. It has been kind of an interesting week for me as I have been talking with different people, and I think with the idea of mother and Mother's Day on their mind. I was talking with a woman yesterday, and she was kind of expressing the idea that Mother's Day for her, it was painful. And a friend of hers had been sharing that with her as well, because it was not something that brought back pleasant memories. And we realize that there are people who have grown up without mothers, and the fact that their mothers may have been gone or may have been deceased, have grown up with abusive mothers, or for those who have been mothers or would like to have been mothers and not able to. There are just so many things that come up and happen in the reality of life. And so as we talk about the idea of mother and motherhood, I think it's important for us to realize that there are concepts here that are not intended to single out one person or one group of people over another, or to stir up painful memories. We really want to think about an ideal here, a goal, something that the Bible is talking about. And so I want to start with a passage from 2 Thessalonians. I used this passage about 5 years ago on Mother's Day, and as I was looking back, and I thought, well, this is a good way to really, begin. Paul writing to the church at Thessalonica, and he says, as apostles of Christ, we could have been a burden to you, but we were gentle among you, like a mother caring for her little children. We loved you so much that we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well, because you had become so dear to us. Surely you remember, brothers, our toil and hardship. We worked night and day in order not to be a burden to anyone while we preached the gospel of God to you. You're witnesses, and so is God, of how holy, righteous, and blameless we were among you who believed. For you know that we dealt with each of you as a father deals with his own children, encouraging, comforting, and urging you to live lives worthy of God, who calls you into his kingdom and glory. The interesting picture that Paul creates there is one of a family. And I think it's important for us as we think about church and we think about the idea of church as community and as family, and rather than as many people think about institution and organization, which is kind of cold and lifeless and indifferent, that using expressions, to describe and illustrate the relationship between Paul and the other apostles and church there at Thessalonica and really through the whole world, that to have that idea that we loved you like a mother, I just kind of, referred to the gentleness. And what's interesting here is the word that's translated gentle here has, some translations have the word kind, but there's a spin to this that is really kind of interesting because, go back to the Greek of the time. Apparently, the idea of the gentleness was of, like, for example, a teacher handling a difficult student. And you think about kind of that image that you get. If I won't embarrass our mothers, but if you think about the fact that parenting, mother, father, even extended family, dealing with children, sorry kids, it's not necessarily an easy thing to do. They are individuals with their own wants and desires and wills, and it can be a bit of a struggle. So as you kind of think about Paul saying that we dealt with you with gentleness, it's actually a kind of an interesting idea. Like a mother caring for her little children, or like a nurse. We have a number of nurses in the congregation, and they are people that I think inspire great respect because of the way that they look after other people, many times in very difficult circumstances. He describes the mother in terms of the giving and the sharing. We associate motherhood with life-giving, and yet not necessarily. So one of the things I kind of always think about at Mother's Day, and this always sounds a little tacky, but I think you understand what I mean, is that I do not know the woman who gave me birth. I've never met her. I don't know her name. I only know the city that she lived in when I was born. And yet she gave me life. She gave me existence. But the woman that I have called mother all of my life is somebody who chose me. And who bestowed, when we talk about adoption, that's the beauty of that idea, is that motherhood is not necessarily biological, nor is it necessarily that relationship. In other words, that people care for one another. And Paul using that idea of this is how he cared for the people at Thessalonica, for the Christians there. That's the one another that we have in Christ. The role of motherhood in nourishing and in self-sacrificing. I don't know if you notice an expression that Paul used there in those verses, but every time I read that passage, I just can't help but hear the voices that say, I don't want to be a bother. Because that's kind of, mothers want to look after, they want to help, they want to nurture, they want to care, but they want to sacrifice. They want to give of themselves for others. And the goal, Paul identifies, is eternal life through the gospel. And then quickly, the father in that passage is really one that has the role of setting the pace for holiness and righteousness, being blameless. But then also in training the children, Paul mentions encouraging and comforting and urging. And so, again, with the direction of lives worthy of God. But as I thought about that expression of how loving a mother can be, I've had a story in my mind that I thought would be worth kind of thinking about this morning. And it comes from 1 Samuel chapter 1. We read part of the story a minute ago. And if you go back to the beginning of 1 Samuel 1, we're introduced to a man named Elkanah. In himself, and while we have a bit of the biography of him, the genealogy, he's not a particularly significant individual. But we learn very quickly that back in the time when the people of Israel were allowed to have more than one wife, he had two wives. One named Hannah, the other Peninnah. And Peninnah had several children. Hannah didn't have any. And as sometimes happens, Peninnah took advantage of every opportunity to rub it in to Hannah, to humiliate and to hurt her. And Hannah experienced great grief. According to what the story tells us, Elkanah liked Hannah better. It's kind of interesting to think about it because according to the law, you weren't supposed to play favorites, but he did. He tried to comfort her by saying, "Aren't I more valuable to you than many sons?" That didn't seem to work. And so what the writer there describes is Hannah's grief. She refers to it as her bitterness of soul. Just that deep grief, the pain, that just nothing seems to help. And so they went to Shiloh, where the tabernacle was set up for a feast. And Hannah got up from the table and she went to the tabernacle to pray. It's quite a remarkable thing when you think about it, and we'll kind of come back to that in a minute. But as she's there praying, and what's really interesting is that she is praying silently. Her lips are moving, but there's no sound there. Part of her prayer is a vow to God that if you give me a son, I will dedicate him. He'll be a Nazirite for all of his life. But as Eli, the high priest, sees her there, he apparently has a chair sitting near the entrance. And he's looking at this woman over there, and she's in grief. She's crying. Her lips are moving, and no sound comes. And so, like many of us, and I'm going to say us, sees the situation and makes an assumption, a judgment of her. She's behaving in a way that is different from him and from what he does, which is kind of interesting to think about. And so he accuses her of being drunk. Put your wine away. Wow. Imagine somebody here who's come to the tabernacle to pray, and you accuse them of being drunk. Great move for the high priest. And so Hannah defends herself and says, "No, I'm not drunk. I am pouring out my soul. I am praying." And so, kind of in a penitent way, Eli responds, "Well, may the Lord give you what you're asking for." It's interesting. It doesn't say that he asked her what she's praying for, which is kind of an interesting thing. He, in a sense, and that's why I use the word blessing, he just kind of blesses her. Well, may God give you what you're asking for. And the amazing thing is that she cheers up, goes back, and is in a totally different frame of mind and mood when she gets back. As you think about this story here, And we're just going to take a minute here to finish the story. Is that in time, she bears a son, names him Samuel. There's some discussion about the meaning of the name, but basically it sounds like something like the Lord has heard. Her promise to give him to the Lord when Samuel's old enough to be weaned, she takes him back to Eli, tells him the story, reminds him of that night that she came praying, and says, this child is the answer to that prayer. And she gives him to Eli to be raised in the service to the Lord at the tabernacle. Eli becomes the last of the judges. You know, if you look back through the book of Judges that go through that period after the conquest of the kingdom, there's the period of the judges. Samuel becomes the last of the judges and one of the first, of the named prophets in the Old Testament. Samuel will later be the one who anoints kings. King Saul, David. That this child born out of promise, if you want to think about it, through her grief and her pain and her agony and her suffering, becomes one of the great characters, one of the great people of the Old Testament. And so what was it about Hannah that maybe is why God chose her and answered her prayer? Well, I think there are maybe 4 things we can point out. Number one is her faith. You may not have thought about it in these terms, but have you ever been really totally, bitterly frustrated and disappointed? Not just in a momentary thing that says, like I didn't get what I wanted. I get a kick sometimes. Every now and again I like to turn on America's Funniest Home Videos. And every now and again, they'll show a video of a child on Christmas Day opening a package, and it's not what the child wanted. And the child sometimes goes into absolute conniptions. That's why the parents got out the camera, right? The child is just ranting. They didn't get what they want, But that's a momentary thing. All you have to do is give the kid a box to play with afterward, and he'll be happy. We're not talking about a momentary disappointment and frustration or grief. We're talking about a long-term situation that it just seems impossible and doesn't seem like it's ever going to work out. And so many human beings, as they do that, they reach a point where they just kind of want to, the expression we use is throw in the towel. They want to quit, give up on God. And yet, don't you think that Hannah must have been praying about this before? I suspect she was. But in this particular case, that as the story kind of reaches this climax where she goes to the tabernacle to pray, that she has just a complete trust in God. That she still wants to take this and to talk to him. You know what it reminds me of is the story where Jesus talked about what's called the importunate widow, who kept coming to the judge, asking him that she just kept coming back and back and back because she didn't get the answer she wanted. And the gospel writer says that the reason that Jesus told this parable was to teach his disciples they ought always to pray and not lose heart. Well, how do you do that? It's through faith. It's through understanding that God has the answer and that that sometimes the answer may not be right now, but it may be later. But if we have something that is a real concern, we need to have the faith to keep praying about it. Obviously, secondly, is the fact that she is a person of prayer. I don't know if you've ever thought about this expression that statement she makes to Eli. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. I've always thought this is an intriguing story. Eli, the high priest, literally the man of God, the leader of the religious community of the Israelites, theoretically is closest to God. He's the one that would go in on the Day of Atonement to present the offering at the Ark of the Covenant. Surely he would know about intense, personal, fervent prayer of pouring out. It kind of reminds me of how many people wind up with a very mechanical view of prayer. More concerned about great prose than they are about great heart. And I kind of wonder, is it possible that at this time the religious community of Israel is being led by people for whom prayer is ritual and routine and repetitive and basically meaningless then? We do it because we're supposed to, not because it's real. And so when Eli the high priest encounters Hannah, who's pouring out her heart to the Lord in tears, who's not even speaking, but her lips are moving, it's a new thing to him. Isn't that incredible? She is a person of prayer. She's a person of courage. I love it. At the time, Israel is being led from time to time by judges, but the only continuous leadership that Israel has had through the time of the judges has essentially been the priesthood. And the high priest would be kind of the ultimate authority. Well, what happens to us when we find ourselves in the presence of people who are, very high authority? We get very quiet, very meek, very timid, very withdrawn. We just, kind of think in the back of our mind, I'm nobody, he's somebody, I don't want my place to say anything. And she's got the courage when he says, quit your drinking. Can't you just see that look on his face? Quit your drinking. To say, I'm not drunk. I am pouring my heart out to the Lord. She has the courage to stand up and to speak about her faith, really, and about her trust in God. She's a person of faithfulness. When Samuel is born, she fulfills the promise that she made to God, that she would bring him and have him raised in God's service, that he would be a Nazirite, that she would come back every year and she would bring him clothing, she would continue to help look after him, but that she understood one concept that I think is really very, very important. And that is the fact that her son, yes, it was her son, but that her son belonged to God. That she wouldn't have him as a son if God hadn't given him to her. And I think in that concept, there is the idea that, if get nothing else out of what we're talking about this morning, I think the idea that we need to understand is that our children are a gift from God. They're a blessing from Him. They're a stewardship that He has entrusted to us to look after and to raise. And as much as Hannah had the concept of dedicating her child to the Lord, that our children belong to the Lord and they're dedicated to the Lord. If we're Christians, our children belong to the Lord. And therefore we have that responsibility to bring them up, as Paul puts it, in the nurture and admonition, nurture and instruction of the Lord. That our challenge, moms, dads, aunts, uncles, grandparents, cousins, is to be part of that community that brings that child to know God, to know Jesus Christ. As we've been singing some of the songs that Chad has chosen, many of them have focused on the idea of commitment and service and giving. And I think those are really well chosen because of the idea of what Hannah represents for us. She's a challenge to us to be parents like her, to bring our children, to give our children to the Lord. As we sing our closing song, hopefully it will be to one that will, for each one of us, remind us of our role in the lives of our children, but also to remind us of our role and our relationship with God. And maybe if you're here and you're not a Christian yet and you want to find out more about that, you can talk with Chad or with me or one of the elders afterward. Let's stand as we sing.